Hello, my name is John Loring and I'm the pastor of the Baptist Church in the Great Valley. Thank you for joining me today. If you would like more information about our church, you can go to our website, www.bcgv.org, and find a selection of children's messages and sermons and other information you may find to be of interest. Today's scripture is from Mark chapter 11. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." Have you ever seen a mime? One of those actors with the white makeup that silently acts out their messages? Some people find them annoying, but they demonstrate a different form of communication whereby you, the viewer, has to be actively engaged, watching, trying to figure out what the message is and what's going on. Jesus did something similar when he spoke in parables. People had to put out the effort and really pay attention if they were going to figure out what the message was. In last week's sermon, I mentioned how it was common for the prophets not only to speak their message, but to act out their message as well. We read the story of King Ahab of Israel trying to coax King Jehoshaphat of Judah into being his ally and to bringing up his army to help with the attack at Ramoth Gilead. Well, King Jehoshaphat wasn't really sure about all this and really wanted to know what God's will was in this matter. So, King Ahab marched out 400 prophets who were all unanimous that this was God's will and that an attack on Ramoth Gilead would be just dandy. One of Ahab's prophets, by the name of Zedekiah, even brought out a pair of iron horns. And he said, "With these you shall gore your enemies till they are all destroyed." Now, he wasn't suggesting that King Ahab was going to literally have iron horns bolted onto his helmet and run around the battlefield goring people, but rather, like a strong bull, he would terrify and defeat his enemies. Acting out a message can be much more compelling than just speaking it. So it was that Jesus was acting out the prophecies of Zechariah by riding into Jerusalem upon a humble donkey as a way of illustrating that he was the Messiah that the prophet had spoken of. In today's passage, it may be that Jesus was again engaged in some religious theater to make his message memorable and powerful. Now, if you've ever watched any of the Jesus movies, you know that the cleansing of the temple is a moment of action and high drama, and the movie producers simply can't resist playing it up with people running and screaming and tables crashing and coins scattering and livestock running around.
these things hence! Make not my father's house an house of merchandise!
But if Jesus had gone rogue, I doubt if anyone would have stopped to listen to what he was teaching. The temple had its own police force to guard the gates and quickly deal with troublemakers. I don't believe that Jesus was trying to single-handedly put an end to all commerce in that vast temple complex. Rather, I think that what Jesus did was done in a very measured and controlled way so that people would stop and look and listen and really hear what it was he was saying. So let's look at this story again and just consider it in a new light. The rebuilding of the temple began under King Herod, was done because of his desire to make it one of the wonders of the ancient world. After 46 years, it was still under construction and was well on its way to becoming a really amazing spectacle. The top of Mount Zion was expanded like a huge stone tabletop. It covered some 40 acres. I mean, more than 3 times the size of our church property. And the temple complex was laid out with a series of courtyards for worship, with the temple building itself in the very center. Inside the temple was the Holy of Holies. This was believed to be the very throne room of God, a dwelling place of God, and it was entered only once a year by the high priest, who asked God's forgiveness for himself and for the people. Then surrounding the temple itself was the court of the priests, where only the priests could worship. Outside of that, a little farther away, was the court of Israel, where Jewish men could worship. Next was the court of the women, and that was surrounded by the outermost court of the Gentiles. And they were welcome to come that far and worship there. Now, whenever there is religious property, there will be competing visions as to how that property should be used. I think that every church has struggled with the question of how to be a good steward of the property that they have been entrusted with. If a church buys the land and erects a building and it assumes all of the expenses of heating it and maintaining it and insuring it, and then only uses it for a couple of hours on a Sunday morning, doesn't seem like very good stewardship, does it? And so people naturally begin to make suggestions. They say, let's rent out a portion to a local daycare that can serve the young families of this community and whose rent would help to pay the bills. But then suddenly you find yourself needing fire alarms and where are we going to store the cots they use for napping during the weekend? You have to divide up the bulletin boards, and you probably have to provide special locks on the doors, and people are going to start wanting to paint rooms a different color, and then you have to deal with Sunday school teachers who are fine with the idea of a daycare, but they don't want anyone to be using their Sunday school room during the week. They want everything just as they left it the week before. And you know what? I get that. I understand that. Years ago, I was volunteering in a community policing office, and every Tuesday night, the volunteers would gather and the captain would pass out the assignments. Sometimes there was paperwork to be done or phone calls to make following up on victims of crime, and it was usually kind of interesting volunteer work. And the captain would say, just grab a desk and sit down anywhere. But the truth of the matter is that the people who worked there all day really didn't like having other people coming in and using their desk in the evening. Volunteers would come in and would sit down and have to adjust the chair to make it comfortable, make it just the right height, and too much stuff on I'll just move this way and I'll move that way and push things back a little bit, and oh, this light is funny, I'm going to pull this over this way. You know, we'd get it all set up for ourselves, and they would come in the next day and their desk, their space had all been shifted around. Now, the officers who worked there appreciated the volunteers. They appreciated the work that we did, but they just didn't like having it happen at their desk. A dozen desks to choose from. And I would go and look and, this one's all covered with cracker crumbs. I'll just move on to the next one. Yeah, this desk has sticky marmalade fingerprints on it. I'll just move along. You see, whenever we step into an organization, we start running into invisible boundaries. We start hitting unspoken rules that everyone understands except the new people. Well, the temple in Jerusalem also faced competing demands on its space. Like so many temples in the ancient world, it served as a bank where people would store valuables, confident that the items there were under God's protection. No one would be rash enough to steal from a temple. And there were storage areas that held all of the supplies that were needed for the normal operation of the temple. Things like wood for the altar and all of the metal tools that were needed when dealing with the fire on the altar. 3 times a year, there were pilgrim festivals where every Jewish male within so many miles was expected to come and worship at the temple. And in fact, faithful Jews from all over the known world would come to be a part of that wonderful spiritual experience. But no one is going to want to travel from Egypt or Greece or Turkey with a sheep to be used as a sacrifice. If you've ever gone on a trip and taken your dog with you, you may well have come to the conclusion that it was just more trouble than it was worth. And for the religious pilgrim, it simply made sense to wait and purchase your sheep when you got to the temple, where it had already been washed and inspected and pre-approved for a sacrifice. Likewise, people from around the ancient world came carrying all kinds of different currencies, but only the faceless Tyrian shekel was accepted for use in the temple, out of respect for the second commandment. And to have someone there who could change your money into the local currency was really a great service to provide. A nice thing that just made the whole experience that much easier. Well, these were services that needed to be available to everyone. So, where can we put them? What part of our temple complex could be dedicated for that use? Where can they be set up? So the fencing for the animals and the tables for the money changers will cause a minimal amount of disruption. Well, obviously you want to push them off to the outside edges. Get them as far away from the actual temple as was possible. And of course, in this case, that happened to be the court of the Gentiles. Now, the Gospel Mark mentions one other aspect of this situation, and that was there were people carrying things across the courtyard. People who had been shopping in Jerusalem or who lived in Bethany or someplace to the east of Jerusalem were confronted with this giant temple complex. And the quickest and the easiest way to get home was to cut through the court of the Gentiles and then out the Golden Gate. And you've saved half a mile in your journey. So Jesus carried out his prophetic demonstration of cleansing the temple while quoting from Isaiah 56. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. In other words, the court of the Gentiles was filled with the hubbub of buying and selling animals for sacrifice. There was the changing of currency. There were people wandering through carrying merchandise from their shopping trip into the city. It was a noisy, rambunctious place, and it robbed the Gentiles of their place to worship God. Now, I doubt if anyone ever said that Gentile worship doesn't matter. It was simply that the needs and the convenience came first. The people of the temple had made it comfortable for themselves, but now there was no room for the stranger. Now, before we start shaking our head and wagging an accusing finger at those first century Jews, we had better ask ourselves if we are honestly open and welcoming to people who might be different from us. In this week's children's message, we learned about Bishop Richard Allen, founder of the AME denomination. And he was instrumental in establishing a number of AME churches in this area. You see, he lived in a time when black people were generally not welcome in white churches. They found themselves pushed out to the edges and beyond. And Bishop Allen responded by starting new churches that valued all people. But it's not just a racial thing. It's a discomfort with strangers. Down through the years when people are going on vacation, I encourage them to go to a church wherever they happen to be traveling for 3 reasons. First of all, it is good to worship God. Secondly, they may see things that are done differently. They might pick up ideas that we might benefit from. And third, it is good to experience what it feels like to enter a church as a stranger. It can feel uncomfortable not to know where to park. It feels uncomfortable not to know which door you're supposed to go in, and even when you enter the sanctuary, you sure don't want to sit in somebody else's pew. If you were to walk in alone, would someone say, hey, come sit with me. Come be a part of my family this morning. Or if you got in late and they were already singing the first hymn, would somebody offer you their hymnal, already turned to the right page? Personally, I feel most uncomfortable if the church happens to have one of those fellowship greeting times, and suddenly, as a visitor, you become invisible. People look right through you as they look for their friends. Members are practically leaping over the pews to hug and greet each other, and you discover you've entered this twilight zone of non-existence. It's good to visit other churches so that you will be in touch with what it feels like to be a stranger or a visitor, and then be able to return and see your own church with fresh eyes. The temple was designed to provide a place for worship for all people, but the needs of the strangers were overlooked. How good are we at making room for and welcoming strangers? Jesus thought this was worth making a ruckus over. Amen.